Hi guys, welcome back to Synch Owners. I'm Matt.
And I'm Greg.
And today we're going to be talking you through the process of changing a tyre on your Synch Super Monkey.
Now, a lot of you may be daunted by the task of doing so, with taking off the tyre and changing the inner tube, but we're here to walk you through it and show you that it's not as bad as you may think.
Nope, so straight away, let's get stuck straight on the tools that you might need to get started with it.
Let's have a look.
So the tools required, we want 3 good quality tyre levers, a 15mm spanner for the front wheel, an 18mm spanner for the rear wheel, a good quality foot pump for pumping the tyre back up, and also if you've got a damaged inner tube, we can also replace that while we're at it. Right, so we're going to need to flip the bike upside down, but before we do that, we'll take the battery off the bike just to remove any extra weight that's not required. If you have any accessories fitted to the top of your handlebars which may prevent the bike from sitting flush when it's upside down, now would be a good idea to remove them. And then for this step of the process, all we're going to do is bring the bike forwards, hold the rear brake, lift the bike up, and then we're going to walk it all the way forwards before we drop it down on its seat and handlebars. If you don't have a mat to work on, it wouldn't be a bad idea to stick a cloth underneath the seat and underneath the handlebars just to prevent you from scratching it on the concrete. So on both sides of the bike there's a cap protecting the back wheel. You want to take the cap off from both sides. And then on the right side of the bike you will find the motor cable. We need to disconnect this before we remove the back wheel. So now it's time to unloosen the back wheel. So we're going to grab our 18mm spanner and we're going to turn this in an anti-clockwise direction. And we're going to keep going with that until the wheel is completely loosened up. And exact same process on the other side of the bike, again in an anti-clockwise motion, unloosening the bolt all the way. We don't need to take it so the bolt comes off just enough so we've got enough slack in the back wheel. And just to make sure you've given yourself enough space on each side, we'll make sure the bolt comes off the thread just to the end there, and that should be enough on both sides. So now we're ready to take the back wheel off. So what we want to do here is we want to pull the derailleur backwards away from the wheel. And then we're going to put one hand underneath the wheel and just pull the whole wheel up and out, making sure that when we do, that the cable coming out from the motor does not catch on the chain. So by doing this we can just pull the chain out of the way, around and lift the wheel out. Right, so now we've got our wheel off. So the one thing we need to be mindful of is that on each side of the wheel there are 2 potential issues. We don't want the disc brake to be touching the floor too heavy, and also on the other side of the wheel we have our motor cable. We need to make sure that this never gets bent or crushed in any way while we're changing the tyre. So the best thing we can recommend is to keep the tyre flat with the cable facing upwards at all times. So now we're going to take the air out of the tyre. To do this we're just going to remove the dust cap and use anything, like you could use a screwdriver or you could use an Allen key, and we're just going to let the air out of the tyre. So now we've got all of the air out of our tyre, so we're going to get the valve. We're just going to push that through the wheel so it's nice and tucked away inside the tyre there. So now we're going to get our tyre levers. We're going to place it underneath the bead of the tyre and pull it up towards the rim. And we're just going to bend that lever back and hook it underneath one of the spokes. And that is the first tyre lever in place. So now we're going to move to the next spoke along, grab the second tyre lever. We're going to repeat that same process, pulling the tyre up to the rim and again clipping it under. And then with our third lever, this should be the final lever that we need. Again, just placing it underneath the tyre, and we're just going to pop it round. So as you probably noticed, when we put the third lever in, the second one came out. That could be perfectly normal. That's because the tyre is now unseated from the rim. And yeah, we can just sort of move forward, remove those levers, and use our fingers to just work the tyre off from around the rest of the wheel. You should find this is very straightforward, as the tyre will now no longer be tight. And finally, to remove the wheel entirely from the tyre, we're just going to stand it upright and we're just going to feed the rest of the tyre off the rim. Again, this is not going to need levers for this time, because the tyre should be mostly slack and it will just feed its way through. So now we've got our wheel separated from our tyre. This would be a perfect opportunity if you had a worn inner tube to take that straight out of the tyre and replace it with our replacement. However, we're not in a position where we need to do that, so all we're going to do is replace the tyre. So now with our old tyre removed and our new tyre ready to go on, the next step is going to be putting a tiny bit of air back in our inner tube. And the reason that we do this is so the inner tube holds its shape inside the tyre when we go to put it back on. So all we really want to do is just give it enough that the inner tube's got a little bit of shape on it again. I'd say that would be enough. So as you can see, when we hold it up, the inner tube now holds its own form, which is perfect. So we're going to grab our partially inflated inner tube and we're just going to seat that on the inside of the tyre, making sure it's tucked up nice and neat around the edges and there's no creases. Now before we put the tyre back on the rim, we need to be aware of the orientation of the tyre. Some do give you an indication on the tyre wall of which way the tread pattern should go, but if not, you can always just look at the tyre itself and make the assumption of which way the tread should go. So on this, we can clearly see as we look around the tread that there is a particular direction in order to disperse water. So let's get the tyre sat on the wheel. So what we need to do first is identify where the valve is. So in this instance we want it at 12 o'clock, and then we also need to make sure that on the top of the wheel our valve entrance point is also at 12 o'clock, and then we're just going to try and feed the wheel straight into the tyre, making sure that both of those match up, and we can use our fingers to guide it all back on. Again, we won't need levers for this stage of the process, and we're just going to feed the tyre onto the rim all the way around. So now we're going to feed the valve through the hole on the wheel, which should be quite straightforward once we manage to find it. There we go. And then we're going to put the valve cap on to make sure that the valve doesn't fall back into the wheel whilst we're going through the rest of the tyre seating process. So now with the wheel laid flat, we're going to feed the front side of the tyre back onto the rim. And by doing this, we're just going to feed it across with our fingers, making sure we don't put too much pressure down on the wheel itself, because as we mentioned at the start of the video, we don't want to bend our disc brake. So as I say, just going to keep feeding that bead all the way around. And that's it. So we now have our tyre seated on the rim. So what we're going to do is double check that it's sitting flush all the way around. So we're going to check that on both sides of the tyre. And then once we're happy that we've got it sitting flush, we'll lay it back flat again and we'll get our pump and start putting a bit of air in it. So now we're going to put some air in the tyre. To do this, we're just going to push on the back of the tyre to make sure that we've got some pressure behind the valve. We're just going to connect up the pump. So we'll probably put about 5 or 6 pumps of air in the tyre now. So at this point, before it gets too inflated, we're just going to double check that it's seated again nice and tightly. Make sure it's even all the way around the bead so the wheel spins nice and level. And once we're happy with that, we'll continue to fill the tyre up the rest of the way. If you're unsure about how much pressure your tyre needs, it's usually written on the sidewall. So in this instance, we can see it says 20 psi, which is the equivalent to 1.4 bars. Right, so before we put the wheel back on, a couple of important notes. So if you look just down there on the wheel, there is a little lug on a washer. This lug has to line up in the dropouts on the back of the frame. So when you put the wheel back on, you will notice that just in this recess on the back of the frame, there is a groove. That lug is going to sit flat with the top of that. And also keeping your eye on the other side of the frame, our disc needs to fit right back in the slot between both of our pads. Again, it should all fall into place, but keep your eye on that as you're putting the wheel back in. Putting the wheel back on is basically just the reverse of taking it off. So what we're going to do is feed the motor cable through first by lifting the chain up and out the way. And we're just going to rest the chain back on the gear ring, pull the derailleur back, and then we're just going to lower it back into position, making sure it sits nicely in those recesses that I mentioned earlier. And that's the wheel mounted back on the frame. So now we're going to move and show you how to tighten it back up again and reconnect the electrics. So now we're going to take our 18mm spanner and we're just going to tighten up both of those bolts on either side of the bike, making sure they are nice and tight. There's not a great deal of room to work with in there, but there'll be enough to get plenty of turns on it. Okay, now it's time to connect up the electronics again. If we look at the top of both of the electronic connectors, you'll see a couple of arrows. We need to make sure those arrows are meeting up next to each other, and you'll feel it click in nicely. And finally, replace the caps on both wheels, just like we took off at the start. Now to put the bike back on its wheels again, we're just going to grab the handlebars, making sure that we hold the rear brake, lift the bike back up again so it stands up, and then just walk it backwards until we can drop it back down on both wheels. So now we just need to make sure we replace our valve cap. We should have checked our PSIs are all okay. And that is one tyre changed on our Super Monkey. Replacing the front tyre is the exact same process, except you'll find it much easier because we don't have the motor that's built into the back wheel. It simply unbolts and lifts out. So there you have it. That's how you change a tyre on a Synch Super Monkey. It was actually Greg's first time changing a tyre today, so how did you find the process?
It's surprisingly easy. I was a bit daunted by it at first, and I'm not just saying that, I actually was. Especially when you consider all the array of stuff on the back wheel, but once it's out of the frame, taking the old tyre off, putting the new tyre on, it does take a bit of effort just to get it over that second lip, but otherwise, no, easy.
Awesome. With that being said, we've left some links in the description for all of the tools and bits and bobs that we used. But yeah, we hope the video helped you on your adventure.
Keep an eye on the channel for further content. See you later.
Take care, guys.